So after my garage walkthrough video at home, I had actually quite a few questions, both direct and in comments, about my daily driver, 2013 Fiat 500 electric. So I figured I'd make $9 or $99 a month, just to keep the company's CAFE score as high as possible, since these are zero-emission vehicles. But it's a shockingly good car, and it's actually a shame that these weren't sold everywhere in the country, because I would say the vast majority of people out there drive less than 80 or 90 miles a day, and this car really doesn't have any problem with that if you drive it sensibly. The differences between this and a standard Fiat 500 are fairly minimal. This is actually based on an Abarth, so the turbocharged car. The front air dam with the dot matrix is different. That's for aerodynamic reasons. You see on the bottom there's a flexible plastic lip. That's also for aerodynamics. The car comes with 15-inch aerodynamic wheels and low rolling resistance 185 tires. I've changed those out to a sticky 17-inch 205 tire and some Sparco Aceto Gara wheels. I've also lowered the car significantly. The side skirts are unique to the Fiat 500 electric, also for aerodynamic reasons. They dropped the drag coefficient, I believe, from 0.36 or 0.37 to 0.31, which is actually tremendously good for a vehicle of this kind of shape and frontal area. You can see the dot matrix carries forward, carries over on the back as well with the rear valance. The 500e were all very, very high specification models. I believe the only option was a sunroof, and there might have been a sport package that started in 2014 that came with the Cicado and the turbo dark taillights and headlights. This is a 2013, so the first year of the electric didn't have any of that optional. I have installed a Curt trailer hitch on this. You can do that just the same as you could on any gas model. You see there is some room. This compartment right here is full of batteries. The compartment up there is full of batteries. And then underneath the foot floor is also about a 4-inch layer of lithium-ion polymer batteries. This car's drivetrain was designed by Bosch and Samsung. It was a joint partnership. They are thermally managed, liquid-cooled, and heated batteries. It's a 24 kilowatt-hour battery pack. The car comes with the charger you see on the right, which is a 110-volt, 15-amp emergency charger. That will charge the car from 0% to full in about 22 hours. The charger on the left is a generic 240-volt, which we call a level 2 charger, as opposed to the level 1. That's a 16-amp 240. That charges the car in about 4.5 hours. At home, I'll pop a picture up. I've got a 32-amp General Electric wall charger, which is as much as this car can charge with. Underneath the fuel door, you find the standard J1772, which is what this connector is called. The vast majority of public level 2 chargers use this plug. It's pretty simple. There's 3 high voltage plugs and there's 2 authentication plugs. The actual charger is built into the car, but what you plug into basically communicates with the car and tells it how much power it's allowed to pull, and if it's 120 volt level 1 or 240 volt, using both the top ones, level 2. Other than that, the fuel door is exactly the same as its gas counterpart, which unfortunately is why this car does not have DC quick charging capability like a Nissan Leaf with a CHAdeMO or the new Chevy Bolt with the I think they call it a CST, which is this connector, J1772, with the 2 flip downs that you can open, and then that uses somewhere between 50 and 150 kilowatts and will usually fast charge a car in about 30 minutes, which is fabulous. That being said, at the 7.2 kilowatt wall charger I have at home, if I bring the car home on 0%, which I do fairly regularly and probably shouldn't, it takes just under 3 hours to fully top it up, which is actually pretty reasonable. There are days when I fully discharge and charge the car 3 times. The electric Fiat has no real interior options. You get vinyl 2-tone interior. They do change up a little bit in style. And then you can also get white interior. The 50-50 split fold rear actually gives you quite a bit of cargo area. The only real difference back here, and this doesn't go down just because I carry both the Chargers, is this false floor. The actual floor of the cargo area sits about 6 inches lower on a gas car, but they gave you a nice compartment for a charger and your flat compressor, which I have since moved to just behind the driver's seat so I can keep both Chargers under the floor. The 500e actually has the largest brakes, friction brakes, of any Fiat 500 sold in the United States. The rotors are the same size as the Abarth, but the brake calipers themselves actually have cast counterweights, and that is basically just to keep the braking squeak and all noise to a minimum because this car is indeed so quiet. With the electric drivetrain, let me pull the key so you don't get that annoying noise. There you see the LCD gauge cluster in kind of rest mode. You'll find standard Fiat 500 upgraded digital climate control. You'll find their Bluetooth head unit. Bluetooth just for hands-free in this car. There's no option for Bluetooth audio, at least not in 2013. The unique feature on the inside, aside from this unique LCD gauge cluster, a lot of the newer gas Fiat 500s do have an LCD cluster, but it's not nearly as high resolution, nor does it tell you nearly as much. The electric also has a 2-tone embroidered steering wheel, orange accents or white, depending on your exterior color. The interior seats carry over that accent. And again, like I said, they are all vinyl on the electric, just to save weight. They are all electrically heated. The reason why they do that is because if you run the full-on HVAC heater, which is an 8 kilowatt unit, you instantly take about 8 miles of range right off the top. And if you run the heated seat, which runs off the 12 volt system, you don't sacrifice any range at all. On the door panels, standard Fiat 500. Again, mine is a non-sunroof car, which is great if you are 6 foot tall or taller for headroom reasons. And it also saves about 54 pounds overall for the car, which does give you a little bit better efficiency rating. I mentioned that the electric models were all very high specification. This is an auto-dimming mirror, which is not at all common on the gas-powered models due to cost, but every electric came with it. So it's a very, very nice feature. Again, you can see the cargo room inside. The wart off to your left there is the stereo amplifier. These cars came standard with the Bluetooth hands-free radio, like I said. This is the Alpine unit, which is actually pretty good. It's a step above the standard no-name unit, and it's a step below. Depending on your year, this would have been an optional Bose car. 2014 and up would have been optional Beats audio. So you may or may not have been able to get that. I don't think you could. The dashboard, of course, says 500e on it, whereas the other cars would just say 500. Up here, you'll find the optional TomTom on the gas car. Electrics all came with it, and it was a unique firmware version on these cars that actually had a little bit of additional data, which would let you see your range at your destination before you set off, and a couple other vehicle power output things. Most of it's redundant and the same as the gauge cluster. Up here, there's a 3-dimensional wart that sticks up, which has, I believe, 5 lights in it. What this does is when you are plugged in and charging, if you're at your lowest power amount, you'll see 1 flashing light. Then when you hit about 15%, that one stays solid. You get another flashing light until you get all the way to the end. You get 5 solid lights, which will stay on while you are plugged in for maybe 5 minutes after it's fully charged. Then the contactor will shut off in the car, and you won't have any lights anymore. So, let me close the door. Got my key in here. It's a standard ignition. So here we have the gauge cluster. I'm going to cycle through the modes. So here's a basic trip. My one kind of gripe about this car is it doesn't give you watt hours per mile, no matter how much you want. It only gives you mpge, which is kind of unfortunate. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Normally it has tire pressure. I didn't put TPM in these big wheels because I didn't care. I'll swap back over to the factory 15s for winter. Yep. And then we have motor power. You can see right now it's showing me 75 miles of range and 78%. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the air conditioner. That immediately drops to 67%. Once the car is cooled off a little bit, the power consumption of the air conditioning compressor does subside a bit, but it does take substantial power, and the heater will take about another 2 miles on top of that. So I guess we'll probably go for a drive now. There's really nothing different about driving this over a gas-powered Fiat 500, except for, as you'll notice, it's very, very fast. It's very quiet, and I'd say the refinement is overall quite a bit better. Fiat went through great lengths to add additional sound deadening behind the door panels, below the rear floor, and on the firewall as well. Oh, I suppose I should show you the engine bay first. While it cools down in here, I'll hop out front and show you what's under the hood. So ordinarily on a 500e, you would have a large plastic covering that just says 500e. I've removed that because I actually kind of like to see what's going on. And, you know, it's just additional weight and sound deadening I don't really care much for. So, kind of the gist of what's going on here. You have your 12-volt standard Fiat 500 battery. This is to run all of your interior accessories. This is your high voltage inverter, so that powers your battery pack, powers all the regen, powers your AC compressor, your heater. This is the control module for your entire electric system. Back here you have our hydraulic brakes, which is tied into your hydraulic regen module under here. This car is capable of doing, I believe, 40 kilowatts of regen, which is really, really high. It's about 90 horsepower versus, you know, some other models that might only offer you 3/4 of that. So when you actually hit the brake, the first portion of the brake travel, which I'll show you, doesn't use friction brakes at all. It actually puts power back into the battery through the inverter. Over here we have 2 cooling tanks. These are for your batteries. It will actually pump coolant through your battery cells when they're hot. Yeah, it's pretty simple under here. You can see a little bit going on right here, the fluttering tags. That's because I have the air conditioning running, which is powering a big 12-volt fan on the front of the engine. Then there is also a high voltage AC compressor, which resides down under here. I'm not going to pull all this apart to show it to you, but you can see that it is not a standard Fiat 500 under here. Well, I'm actually going to go down to windows down, no air conditioning, just to give you a better idea. So all I've done is put my foot on the brake, hit the little D button. If you listen very carefully, you can hear the fan on the inverter that just kicked in. I'm going to go ahead and turn off stability control just because that's how I drive. And off we go. I'm just going to pull slowly out into the street here. So all I've done is take my foot off the brake, and we are creeping. Electric cars don't typically do this, but in order to capture the Fiat 500 demographic that's used to automatic transmissions and trying to keep the transition as friendly as possible to the gasoline-powered vehicle people, they've built in a creep feature in drive and reverse. This cannot be disabled, unfortunately, nor can, when you start from a dead stop here, which I'll do in just a second, the gauge on the right, where you see charge, eco, and power, you watch that as I pin the throttle here, and you'll see it won't actually give me full power until 15 or 20 miles an hour. And they mainly did that because of the really small, low rolling resistant tires fitted to this car. But for people that fit larger wheels and tires and would like the additional off-the-line power, I do wish there was a way to correct that. I'm actually going to flip over to motor power here so you can see just how many kilowatts this does put out, even with a 77% charge. So as you can see, the car it's very quiet, it's very, very strong. If I bring it back down to, let's say, 15 miles an hour, and I pin it, the 15 to 40 acceleration is really, really something special. Driving this car in our downtown area, you can really squeeze it wherever you need to, which is absolutely fabulous. Go back to windows up here. Turn on the air conditioner. So I really don't know how well this will or will not come across just because I am using a lavalier microphone for this portion of the drive here. But it is very, very quiet. It's a nice place to be. If I was using the stereo, it's actually a very nice unit. The ride with the factory 15-inch wheels and the 185 summer tires is really, really quite nice. Very refined. It rides like a very big car. The standard Fiat 500 gas weight distribution is about 63% front. I think it's whatever the reciprocal of that is in the back. This car actually shifts the weight balance to predominantly in the rear due to the 650, actually it's more than that, I think it's almost 900, no it is 650 pound, 24 kilowatt Samsung battery pack. I believe it's 54% of the weight's in the back on this car, so you get a much more stable ride. And again, I've lowered this car, put it on very stiff springs. I have sticky tires, so what you're hearing, anything that you're hearing that's rattling or clunking is also my trailer hitch maybe. You wouldn't get that with a normal off-the-line 500e. I mainly did it for looks and for handling. It handles quite a bit better. The standard 15-inch wheels and low rolling resistance Firehawks are definitely better for economy. This car, like I said, it won't give you watt hours per mile. It will give you mpge. So that's assuming a constant for fuel. Basically, you burn a gallon of fuel and you take how much energy it has. It's assuming a number for that, which is not really great, especially when kilowatts make so much sense with electronic cars. But a lot of people are able to get, let's say, 170 to 210 kilowatt. Excuse me. What am I trying to say here? Sorry, I was turning. They're able to get, 170 to 210 mpge. That's what I was looking for. I typically see between 140 and 160 as my top with these bigger wheels and tires, so it does make a substantial difference. For the worse, unfortunately. It's something where I have such a short commute. I do about 11 miles each way to work, where I don't notice any detriment to it, especially with the fast charger that I do have at home. But it's something you should definitely take into account if you want to make one of these things look as cool as possible. You're going to pay a decent electric mileage penalty. But even with the reduced range that I see, and with the reduced efficiency, it's rare that I'll get fewer than 70 miles of actual range out of the car, which is, like I said, with my commute, that's no problem. I could not plug my car in and do my daily round trip twice. That's even with the air conditioning or the heater. Right now it's perfectly reasonable in here. It's 83 degrees outside. It's really not too bad. But if you were doing a heavier city mix, which the car is much happier with, as well as maybe doing windows down versus air conditioning, and you had the factory wheels and tires, you would easily be able to squeeze more than 100 miles out of one of these things. Again, there are people on the forums that are doing 120 miles on a charge when they're being careful. I bought this car to replace my daily driver, so I wanted to drive it like I would my gas car, and it responds perfectly reasonably to that as well. Better than I would have expected. And the real world range is on par or better than the original I think it's 24 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf. It's not quite as good as the new 30 kilowatt hour model, and it is slightly better than the BMW i3, again the first generation one before they upgraded the battery pack. As far as real world driving mileage, I think the main reason is just because of how light it is. how slippery it is, even though the drag coefficient on this car is not as good as an i3 or a Leaf, because it is a retrofit. And then it also beats out the Golf E, or the e-Golf, however you want to call it. So this is a truly impressive car, and I think the main thing it has going for it is it really doesn't look like an electric car. So if you want to ease yourself into EV ownership and you're really not sure if it's going to be your style, you can get one of these. I mean, this is not a typical deal, but I only paid $5,500 for this car with 46,000 miles on it, actually a little less. So I've put 3,000 miles on it over the summer already. I really haven't had any issues with it. It's still under factory warranty until 50,000 miles. And, it was only $670 maybe to ship it up from California, just because I'm 2,100 miles away. It would have taken me a month to drive this car home without, a known charging infrastructure along the way. And again, this has been my main daily driver. I've forced myself to drive this unless it's a trip that I know is longer than the vehicle's range will allow. And it's performed wonderfully. All of the systems work really, really well together. It does not feel like a compliance car. It feels like something that was engineered from the ground up to be an EV. And clever things like that charge indicator on the dash, which tells you just how much battery charge you have when you're in your garage, or if you street park it and leave it plugged in. It's nice. I mean, it tells you without getting your shoes and clothes on, potentially, if you can make the trip that you're about to go on. So that's very cool. The gauge cluster is fabulous. Again, my only gripe with the electronics on this car and the readout is I really wish it would give me watt hours per mile, or like a more detailed consumption or regen graph. And then the only way to keep this car in regen is to use the brake pedal, which uses a combination of electric regen and the friction brakes. You can't just electronic regen unless you lay off the throttle. So I'll accelerate up here to 40. And I'm going to take my foot off the the electric pedal. And you can see that there's a little bit of blue on the charge there, and then we're pulling a few kilowatts out of the motor. If I touch the pedal, you see it goes to full charge, and we're not doing any more regen until I actually put my foot in it like I am now. But we're not just regenerating with electric power, and we're also using the brake lights, which I don't really like either of those things. Again, this is nitpicking. The car is really, really good, but I do wish it was like the Hyundai Ioniq or a couple other cars that have a button or a paddle on the side of the steering wheel that would let you manually pull a little bit of regen out of it without using any friction brake. This is really obtuse and hyper-miley, and it's kind of ridiculous. You don't certainly have to agree with me on that, but I find very little fault with the car after owning it for about 4 months. I've lived with it. Even the first 3 months I owned it, I charged it with nothing but that emergency charger in the trunk. Like I said, it's about 22 hours as a full charge, which isn't too great, but I was able to, use 60% of the battery during a day and then charge it up fully overnight and go to work. I have the fortune of working next door to a Goodwill, actually, that has a free 40 amp level 2 charger, so I could always top up at work no matter how low I was for no money at all. But my home charging, ever since getting that level 2 charger installed, has actually gotten cheaper as well, because for reasons unknown to me, I'm not really an electrician or an engineer. The higher the voltage you pull off the grid to charge, the lower the cost per kilowatt hour, or the faster you use them somehow. But basically, if you charge this car from 0% to 100 with the emergency charger on a standard outlet, and if you do the same thing with even a 16 amp level 2, it's going to cost you about 60% as much to charge it with the level 2 charger. So if you're going to have one of these, you're going to drive it as much as I do, it actually does make financial sense to A, get a level 2 charger, B, if your power company offers any sort of credit for getting a charger, and C, if you can get off-peak electric rates, which not all power companies do. Mine does not, unfortunately. That does involve a separate meter tied into your house or your garage, which only is connected to your EV charger typically. But that sometimes can drop your let's say you're getting charged 14 cents per kilowatt hour from your electric company, that might drop it to 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you're driving this as your primary daily driver, that could honestly pay off. I mean, that's about $2 in savings a day on one charge on this car, 24 kilowatt hour. So if you're charging a 100 kilowatt hour Tesla or something like that, an off-peak would pay for itself very, very quickly, especially if you're putting a lot of miles on. On a car like this, again, I'm paying 14 cents a kilowatt hour where I live. I live in a city. It's really not too bad. It cost me about $2.30 to fill this thing up at my house, and of course nothing if I charge at work, which I do very often. And I don't buy any gas anymore, even though I have about 10 cars, just because this is the one that gets driven everywhere. If you guys have been watching for a long time, you know that I had a 2013 Fiat 500 Sport, 1.4 liter gasoline Fiat. I had that for about 4 years. I got this car for fun, and I ended up selling the gas Fiat about a month ago, just because I wasn't driving it at all. This car is that good, and it is realistically something that you could use as your everyday car. I mean, I decided to throw myself into it and really not give myself a lot of options, and it hasn't been a problem at all. The car has behaved, like I said, perfectly. It hasn't put a foot wrong. All the systems on it work perfectly. It's got cruise control, air conditioning, Bluetooth hands-free. It's got all the creature comforts. It even had heated seats, which my old Fiat did not. So if you're thinking about getting one of these things, I highly suggest going online. There's a company that deals with nothing but selling off-lease Fiat 500s. They're called Frontline Remarketing. That's not who I bought this car from, but I almost did. And they have just heaps and heaps of these things for the low to mid 6,000 range. Really, as far as I can tell, there's no real reason to not buy one with a lot of miles on it. And then they have several pretty cute color combinations. They've actually got a two-tone orange and white, which I very nearly purchased, but I'm just kind of a dirty guy. Oops. And I figured that interior would not fare well. But I mean, this car has done 50,000 miles and it feels brand new. So again, sorry if that was a little bit wordy, but I've had people with a lot of questions about the 500e, just because this is such a niche car and it's not sold in Minnesota where I am. I do see quite a few of these locally. There's a company, a dealer actually just out west of the Twin Cities here, that does nothing but buy these off lease. So you can see a trip summary on that cluster there. They do nothing but buy these off lease and sell them, and I think it's about $7,500 here. But that means you don't have to ship it, and I don't know. There's a lot of good stuff with this car. So if you've got an extra 5 or 6 grand kicking around and your commute is shorter than 50 or 60 miles, something like that, this might make a ton of sense for you to get. And just the quality of the drivetrain inside this car is way beyond what this price point of entry is. And I think, personally, it's a better car than a Nissan Leaf or even an e-Golf, even though the interior is not up to the par of the Volkswagen.